Welcome to Your Need to Know. I'm your host, Catherine Reed, and today we're talking with a candidate for the Fairfax County School Board, Jane Cohen, who is running to represent the Springfield District. Thank you so much for being here, Jane.
Thank you so much for having me, Catherine.
So I just want to remind people at home that it's an election year.
Yes, every year in Virginia is an election year.
And when you knock on doors, are you finding that people are like, oh, right, it's an election year? Or people are like, what? It's an election year again?
Yeah, by and large, people are shocked that we have elections every year, and so they had no idea. Or people will say, oh, I just voted. And like, that was the primary, and we're so appreciative that you did, but then you have a job to finish November 5th.
Yeah, and so in Virginia, we vote every year, and we're on a 4-year cycle. And so I want to remind folks that the first year of that cycle is we all vote for president in 2020. And then we are one of 2 states that have off-year elections for governor. Us in New Jersey, we elect the governor the year after everybody voted for the president. By the time we get to the midterms in year 3, there is a dramatic drop-off, like a dramatic drop-off. But now we're in year 4. This is the off-year election where 30% of Virginia voters will decide who is in the Senate, who is in our House of Delegates, who is on our Board of Supervisors, on our school board, who's our sheriff, our Commonwealth's attorney, our treasurer, our commissioner of the revenue, and who is on our soil and water board. So 30% of the electorate this year will elect the largest number of elected officials in Virginia. Do you think, as you talk to people, they really grasp this?
I don't think that they do. I think so many people are not even aware of who their Board of Supervisor is, who their school board member is, sometimes not even who their House of Delegate member is. And so it's very disappointing to see. I think that people don't realize when they think so much about what's happening in Virginia and frustrations with all kinds of things, obviously gun sense laws being a big one that's been in the news recently. I don't think they realize the power that they have just with their feet to make really significant change. Because when you talk about 30%, you're talking about such a few number of people who are making those decisions.
And I'm glad you brought up shoes and feet, because the analogy I like to use is Dorothy and her ruby slippers when she discovers all along she had the power to go home, right? And I sort of feel that way about Virginia voters. It's kind of like, I don't know what to do about all these terrible things that are happening. Well, click your heels at the polls, because the power, if you're over 18 years old, is something you've always had.
Absolutely. And I do think our elected officials we see in Springfield, our candidates that are running for delegate and for Board of Supervisors, and our campaign certainly are out there and have been out there every day knocking doors and just talking, having those conversations with voters one-on-one, and just trying to remind them how important this is, that your silence is approval of what's happening. And sometimes even if you're happy with what's going on, you still are not having any say in what's happening and not being a resource to those elected officials when you don't engage with them in any way.
So describe the Springfield District, because there's 9 magisterial districts in Fairfax County, which is a huge county of like 1.2 million people or something. It's a lot of people here. So these 9 magisterial districts every year grow in population. But they, like many other districts in Virginia, are gerrymandered, and they will be redrawn, I'm sure, at some point once the census is done. But describe for our viewers what Springfield encompasses.
I think so many people will come to me and say, oh, I live in Springfield, I'm so excited I can vote for you. And the truth is, not many people in Springfield are actually in the Springfield Magisterial District. Most are in Lee, some are in Braddock. So for us, it starts in Springfield, but moves all the way down to a little bit of Lorton, down to Clifton, Fairfax Station, Fairfax, and then all the way up, crosses over I-66, and winds up in Chantilly area, and then comes back down, again, a little more Fairfax, and some of Burke, but not all of Burke. The vast majority of Burke is actually in the Braddock district. So it's a very oddly shaped district, not surprisingly probably, and it really encompasses from the 5-acre estates that are in Clifton to apartments up in Chantilly area. Every socioeconomic background that you can imagine, people with all different kinds of life experience. So it's a really rich community that I think is ripe for some really good leadership because they have so much to offer.
And there are different pyramids, correct? So when you talk about like the Chantilly pyramid of schools, and that's the high school, middle school, and elementary schools, as opposed to ones that might be down in Lorton or closer to Springfield. These are very kinds of different communities because of the makeup of the neighborhoods, the actual neighborhoods that they serve.
Absolutely. And in Springfield, we actually only have a few schools that are fully in Springfield District, and many other magisterial districts have the same thing where we feed multiple schools. So a school like Lake Braddock, for example, is actually located in the Braddock district, but 60% of Springfield families feed it. So you really have a mix. That's why it's so important to have good relationships with your colleagues on the board, the school board in particular, because you're sharing schools, so you're sharing an experience, so you have to be able to really work together.
And you need to be able to represent all of the different focuses that many of these schools, many of these neighborhoods have. Like you
Right.
said, it's a very big county. There's very affluent people, and there are people who are really struggling, and
Right.
and their children are in our school systems. So it's very important to be able to be representative of everyone. Tell us a little bit about your background and how you decided, wow, I think I want to run for the school board.
I was a preschool teacher and long-term sub in Fairfax County Public Schools and went through all the rungs of PTA. We talk about being voluntold all the time, and wound up as PTA president, and getting to see sort of the different perspectives as a parent of two kids in the schools, then getting to have some of that staff perspective, and then certainly from the PTA. I really felt like I had a unique position to be able to say, these are really how things are working together, maybe how they should work together or how they're not working together. And so for us, that background just led to a real interest in education advocacy. For me, the beginning of education advocacy was after Sandy Hook, when I had two little elementary schoolers that I had to drop off the next day. And we were a school that was built as an open concept, open classroom concept. So we had no doors on our classes. And after Sandy Hook and learning what had happened, I immediately called the principal the next day and said, can we get doors? And he said no, because we were going to be in the renovation queue, which is a multi-year process. And I just could not accept that that was the case. And so I started talking to the people above him and wound up with our school board members and the superintendent, and had the opportunity as a long-term sub the next fall to lock those doors when I did a lockdown drill with my second graders. So I think that was a very powerful thing to see there was a need that needed to be met, and that the voices of parents could really join together and make this change, even though our administration had said no. And so that was kind of the beginning for me of this love for advocacy and being able to be helpful in places where they just needed a voice.
And you have two children in the school system.
I do. I have a 12 and a 14-year-old, and one headed into 9th grade and one headed into 7th grade. So we are full in at Lake Braddock, and it's been really fun to get to watch them go through the system.
And so, too, you've also identified having two children in the school system. I know I had a child who was labeled learning disabled and had an IEP, and that's a journey all by itself that no one prepares you for, because I didn't know what it was and
Yep.
I never heard of it, and he was the youngest of my three. But I was ill prepared, and this was back in the 90s and the 90s. Early 2000s, for trying to figure out how to work with the school system. And I think a lot of parents don't know how to work with the school system if you have a child with special needs, but also if you just have children who need some extra help and are the ones that aren't the brilliant ones and they don't have an IEP, but they need additional help.
Right. I think that all of our kids, so often, whether you are a kid who has some special needs, whether you're a kid who is soaring academically, whether you're a combination of the two or somewhere in the middle, there are so many avenues for parent advocacy where kids are only getting what they need when they have parents who have the resources and the understanding to make that happen. And so going through that experience in our own family, and working for 8 years to get our daughter what she needed, but then also as a staff member being on the other side of that table and having, to present for my own students and really fight for them when we saw some real needs, and watching how the system worked from that side really led me to feel like we have to do more in this county to make sure that we're not relying on the parents to be the advocates. We have to give teachers more autonomy to be able to be the voices for their kids, who, especially when they're struggling, but when they need extra resources as well.
So, you know, there's a lot, as we said, there's great affluence in this county, and there are people who are working 2 and 3 jobs whose children don't have the benefit of a parent advocate, who don't have someone to help them with homework, or even someone who speaks English at home. And so those kids do tend to struggle to stay on grade level, and it does put pressure on the school system to provide some additional resources. On the other hand, SOLs tend to rule everything, and the problem when you don't have students performing at grade level, especially on math and reading, is it comes back to the teacher.
Right. Instead of really measuring progress, which is truly like the only indicator of what's happening in a classroom, is your kid making progress? Not progress on some prescribed test that is just a pass-fail. Ultimately, it's not a good measure of not only their knowledge of the subject, not even just the teaching of the subject, but it's not a good indicator of their success later in school, in college, certainly not in their career fields. So what we find is this reliance on prescribed testing has really taken away so much autonomy from our teachers, but also really sucked a lot of the joy of learning from our kids.
And the joy of teaching, I would imagine.
Absolutely. When teaching and you realize that you can't pace curriculum in a way that maybe makes sense, like you're teaching about monarchs and milkweed in May when they're neither monarchs nor milkweed, because that's not on the SOL. So instead of doing it front loading. So it really does mean that we change the way we teach, and we use these metrics that are not indicators of success either for the teacher or for the kids. And so that's something that has to change. And it's certainly something I'm very committed to working with our General Assembly delegation to make changes in Richmond where we are getting those SOLs out of elementary schools.
As they should be. And I think the recess bill that was passed recently shows, again, to your point, how being engaged, having a delegate that knows what the challenges are, works with educators for the benefit of the students, all works. And so when we come back from this break, we will be talking with Laura Jane Cohen, candidate for school board. See how fast that went?
That was so quick.
Welcome back to Your Need to Know. I'm speaking with Laura Jane Cohen, who is running for the Fairfax County School Board from the Springfield Magisterial District. Thank you so much for being here, Laura Jane.
Thank you for having me, Catherine.
So you are actually running against an incumbent. There's a number of seats on the school board that have opened up. There's a number of people who've retired, who left for other reasons to run for other offices. This is not an open seat. You're running against an 8-term incumbent. And I think our viewers would probably like to know what motivated you to decide to challenge somebody who's been so firmly entrenched in the school board.
Sure. For us, it was definitely a family decision, and really following it as a staff member, as PTA president, as a parent, following what was happening in our Springfield district, and really feeling like there was such a big disconnect in seeing a representative who didn't represent our family, didn't represent other families like our family, and was not engaged in our community at all. And that was an easy decision for us because we saw things like her support to add more guns to schools after Parkland, including even saying that arming teachers was on the table. Seeing the pushback of her not wanting to include our LGBTQ staff and students in our non-discrimination policy in the county. So for us, what we saw is someone who talks about family values but doesn't represent any of the values of our family and we believe of our community. And what we're hearing from voters is that is the case.
Right, and so I have been in a number of school board meetings. I sat for many years on the board of Equality Virginia, and Ryan McElveen, when he came on the school board, really put forward a policy about non-discrimination of both staff and students who are LGBTQ. And it was a very fraught discussion, and I can say that I've spent some time sitting there listening to the various school board members, including the incumbent that you're challenging. And I do think that because so many people don't understand her positions, that they maybe are not aware that it's not in line with their own values. But what would you suggest that they do?
I would say definitely Google Elizabeth Schultz, and you can learn fairly quickly where she stands on positions. My fundamental belief is that they are to the far right of the vast majority of where we are. They're not driven by student success, which is really what we ought to be talking about on the school board. How do we make sure that our kids leave our schools, walk across that stage, and are prepared for what the world is going to offer them? And that's what should drive school board decisions, not these hyper-partisan
ideas of family values.
Right.
And like I said, everybody's got their own idea, but there are members of the school board, for instance, and not particularly this incumbent, but another one who believes that family life education should be an opt-in rather than an opt-out.
She is one of those that believes that.
Right. So in other words, like all the families are going to teach, evidence-based, medically accurate, sex education at home, like all that's going to happen at home.
Right.
And I don't think people living in the 21st century believes that that is true.
Right.
A lot of students are not going to get information that is evidence-based, medically accurate, that is inclusive and accepting of who they are, unless the school system provides a curriculum that is standardized. And that is, of course, our family life education curriculum. Recently, Eileen Fillercorn was successful in getting legislation passed to include consent.
Right.
These are things that, this is the 21st century, and our students and our young people live in it.
Right.
So whatever you practice at home or whatever your faith belief is, that's wonderful, but it should not be driving science-based education, at least in my opinion.
I agree, and I think, one of the things that we have to realize, in particular as educators, our goal from the preschool level up through high school and even with administrators is to become trusted adults in kids' lives. Because unfortunately, what we see is there are so many kids that we have in Fairfax County who don't have a trusted individual that they can talk to. And so we do have a responsibility, I think, in that role to make sure that we are giving medically accurate, scientifically based conversations, because we cannot rely on the fact that those are happening at home. If they are, that is wonderful. We would never want to take away from that. But we are not a substitute for the family, but we are trusted adults, and we have a responsibility to behave in that way.
And things like pregnancy prevention, sexually transmitted diseases, it's kind of like if you are not going to protect children at the most fundamental level, and this is protecting their health and well-being, then what is the point of having family life education?
Well, and we have a school board member who thinks that it's some sort of strange sexualization, the idea that we would talk about menstrual supplies in elementary school, But when we look at many kids have started their periods by the time that they're 11 years old.
That would be me.
Yeah,
I'm just oversharing here, but I was 11 and I was in 5th grade.
Yeah.
Right?
Yep.
And so that was before we even got to middle school where they talked about it in health class.
Right. And we in Fairfax County have to remember that our elementary schools go to 6th grade. So what you're talking about is the vast majority of girls are having their periods in elementary school. And not only is it embarrassing, not only is it scary if you haven't had those conversations, the idea that you have this responsibility in trying to figure out what to do.
How to manage it.
And so it was such a strange hill to die on to me to be so horrified by the idea that we would have pads in the restrooms in elementary schools. I found that to be such a confusing thing to me.
Oh, and I agree. And of course, I work with BRAS, Bringing Resources and Aid to Women's Shelter.
They're awesome.
Holly Siebold, and Holly's the one who's actually done a pilot program in the Manassas Park City Schools in the middle school and high school. She's actually done paper-based surveys to girls to ask them how much class time they miss trying to track down a pad from the nurse's office.
Right.
Some of them are embarrassed or traumatized to ask a teacher to raise their hand and say, I need to go to the nurse's office. To be in a crowded nurse's office waiting in line to ask for a pad.
Right.
I mean, and so some of them don't come to school or will call because their clothes are ruined. They will call a parent in the middle of the day to come and pick them up.
Right.
This is girls losing education time in our classrooms that boys do not.
Right.
It is an equity issue.
Absolutely. And we have kids from all over who come from backgrounds where periods are not something that you talk about, in particular with men. And we are fortunate enough to have really great male staff in a lot of our schools and in our clinics. So for girls, there are many girls who feel like it is wrong. I mean, even if they needed something, that is not a conversation that is ever culturally appropriate. And so we really do talk about that if our goal is that we want kids in the classroom as much as humanly possible, which we absolutely do, then we need to support them in that endeavor. And for girls, it means that menstrual supplies are a really important part of being in the class.
It absolutely is. And this is something that we have asked the school board to provide. And it's not just about poor children. New York City has mandated that their public schools will have these supplies in the restrooms so that they are where they are needed at the
Right.
time they are needed.
Right.
And it's not just about poverty. And
Right.
there are students clearly who cannot afford many things, school lunches, clothes,
Sure.
but this is for everybody.
Right.
And I think if you are not a woman who has menstruated, then you definitely do not understand that even the most prepared person's not always prepared for the thing that's hard to predict.
Right, and it's yet another responsibility that we put on our already overburdened teachers. I had many friends at the upper grade levels in elementary school, starting as early as 4th grade, who would keep period supplies in their classrooms paid for out of their own money. Because they knew that their kids, some of them didn't even really understand what was happening. And so they knew that they were going to have to be involved in those conversations. And that's already, we're asking so much of our teachers already, and now we're asking, them to provide these as well. And it makes no sense to me, the idea, there doesn't seem to be an issue with my opponent of having those supplies in the health clinic. So I'm just confused about why having them in the restroom.
Where it makes sense for them to be at the time they are needed.
Right, exactly. So, and it really minimizes the amount of time that our kids are out of class.
It's really interesting. I've done several interviews with Holly, but we were talking about literature, and the first time periods are mentioned in children's literature is 1965 in The Long Secret, and it's by the author of Harriet the Spy. And the editor, Ursula Nordstrom, had to fight to keep this mention of periods, menstruation, in this book, and caught so much flack from librarians. But my daughter, who's 33 years old, said to me, I can't believe it wasn't until 1965 that a book mentioned it at all.
Right.
So Stella Pekarsky, who's running for school board in the Sully district, looked it up. Only 15 books have ever mentioned periods. And we wonder why a 4th grader who gets her period and does not understand what's happening to her body wouldn't know.
Right. Right. And again, you hope that if that happens in school, that instead of hiding it, instead of being ashamed, that she would go to that trusted individual, that she would be able to use the trust relationship that she's developed with her teacher or an IA or another staff member to be able to say, I'm not sure what to do. I don't. And so we need to encourage girls to talk, freely about what happens. It is a natural occurrence. And as much as we can support that without putting girls in a more awkward situation than we already do, I'm confused about being on the other side of that.
Well, ultimately, I'd like to see menstrual supplies in restrooms, just like toilet paper, soap, and paper towels.
Right.
Because it's a needed supply. And,
right.
And you need it where you need it.
Right. And drying your hands is not a necessity. It's great and it's,
right.
important. But when you think about the difference between paper towels that we would never think about
not having,
and menstrual supplies, it's a confusing topic.
It is a confusing topic, and I think a lot of the pushback is, well, we've never had to provide them before, so why now? Well, you know something? Women have been oppressed for a very long time. Women and girls have been oppressed for a long, long time, and I think we have pivoted after 2016 to a time where women and girls are like, hey, wait a minute, just because you haven't done it before doesn't mean it wasn't the right thing to do all along.
Right.
So where
just like running for office.
Right, just like running for office. And so where can people find more information about you, Laura Jane?
At laurajanecohen.com. We're also on Facebook and Twitter, at LJ for FCPS. And I hope that you will come ask questions. We'd love to hear from you. Always happy to answer them and learn more about our family's experiences in Fairfax County Public Schools.
And we'll just remind everybody too that Election Day is November 5th.
November 5th.
But people can vote absentee in person. There are kind of like questions about that, like, are you going to be out of the area or out of town? Students who are going to school somewhere else can get an absentee ballot and vote by mail.
Right.
So it's not just about November 5th. Let's just remind everybody
Absolutely.
that you need to vote on Election Day or before Election Day because your vote matters to your community, and this is what you need to know.